A gray, icy commute in Ottawa, a long bus ride for local soccer fans, and high-stakes meetings in Washington and Victoria over tariffs and the future of North American trade. Later in the brief, the one clause inside CUSMA talks that could ripple into grocery bills and streaming in Canada. This morning in Ottawa, expect about -2 to 2 degrees Celsius, with rain likely at times. And a quick local sports note, Atletico Ottawa's big continental home match didn't happen at home. Because TD Place is tied up with Lansdowne 2.0 construction, the club's designated home leg was moved to Hamilton. Supporters organized a bus that left Ottawa early afternoon and got back around 5 a.m., and the on-field result was rough, eliminated by Nashville 7-0 on aggregate. For fans, the bigger story is what home advantage means when the stadium calendar is out of your control. Turning now to Ottawa and policy, 2 education stories to watch. High school students in the city's East End walked out to protest proposed OSAP changes that would shift support heavily from grants to loans, roughly from today's 85-15 split to something closer to 25-75. At the same time, adult learners at Ottawa's adult high school are worried about a planned change starting in September 2026 that would move students over 21 into a continuing education model, with unanswered questions about programming and supports. And before we get to the main thread, the federal government is rolling out another tariff-related response package, $228.8 million over 3 years for retraining and supports in Ontario industries hit by U.S. tariffs, plus $94.5 million to improve labor market data. Ottawa also announced more than $900 million through the National Research Council for Defence Innovation, including drone work and a Canadian-built Bombardier Global 6500 to be used for defense-related technology development, part of a bigger push to build domestic capacity. Now, to the story pulling a lot of strings together today, Canada-U.S. trade talks are back, in person. Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc met U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer in Washington, the first face-to-face since negotiations were called off last October. LeBlanc's office called the discussion constructive and substantive, which is diplomatic language, but the context is unusually sharp. The U.S. has tariffs hitting multiple Canadian industries, including steel, aluminum, automobiles, softwood lumber, copper products, and even manufactured goods like kitchen cabinets. Here's the key point. These talks aren't just about removing one tariff at a time. They're being folded into the renegotiation of CUSMA, the trade agreement that sets the rules for most Canada-US-Mexico commerce. And the U.S. wish list is not small. 2 items being flagged: greater access to Canada's dairy market, and changes around requirements tied to Canadian content and funding obligations on U.S. streaming platforms. Those are politically sensitive in Canada because they touch household budgets, cultural policy, and economic priorities. And the idea of what the agreement is for. The risk here is structural. U.S. officials have floated a range of escalations, new tariffs, breaking CUSMA into separate bilateral deals, or even terminating the agreement. If that happened, Canadian exports could face broader, less predictable tariff exposure. For a city like Ottawa, that's not abstract. It shows up through federal budgeting choices, public sector planning, and the health of Ontario's manufacturing supply chains, especially autos and steel, where policy shocks tend to land fast. Midway reset. If you remember one thing from this section, it's that tariff relief and CUSMA renegotiation are now the same conversation. What Canada can get on one depends on what it concedes or refuses on the other. A parallel signal came from the West Coast. BC Premier David Eby met U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra in Victoria for about 45 minutes, describing it as productive and frank. They touched softwood lumber tariffs, money laundering and transnational crime, BC's ban on American alcohol, and the CUSMA talks themselves. Hoekstra's public posture was upbeat, but he also suggested any major updates would come from the U.S. President or the Canadian Prime Minister, meaning provinces can press their case, but the real levers are still federal. One more story, briefly, because it shows how Canada is drawing boundaries with Washington even while cooperating. National Defence says intelligence gathered during Operation Caribou, Canada's annual naval contribution to Caribbean counter-drug missions, is restricted, so it won't be shared with parts of the separate U.S. campaign, Operation Southern Spear, that has carried out lethal airstrikes on suspected drug boats. The department says it has safeguards in place. Critics of the U.S. strikes call them illegal killings. The important takeaway is that Canada is trying to stay inside a seize and arrest lane, while operating in the same waters as a more militarized approach. Final piece to watch: what comes next in the trade talks will likely be measured in timelines, not headlines. Look for 3 markers: whether the U.S. tariffs begin to narrow or expand, whether dairy and streaming rules are formally put on the table in CUSMA text, and whether leaders signal they're aiming for a unified 3-country deal or something more fragmented. Uncertainty remains high, but the direction is clear. The U.S. is using tariffs to create leverage, and Canada is trying to turn that leverage into a rules-based renegotiation, rather than a series of one-off concessions. That's the brief for Wednesday, March 11th. Stay steady out there, and we'll come back to what moves and what doesn't on the trade file.